It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Earlier this month, we launched an occasional series that we're calling America 251, Dialogue, Not Diatribe. America 251 because after the polarized bitterness of the country's 250th birthday year, let's actually listen to each other in year 251. Dialogue, not diatribe, as a perennial value of this show and of public radio generally, as we will continue to try to be a place where people who disagree with each other in good faith do actually listen to each other and interact in a constructive way. And as it turns out, the divisions in this country are not just Democrat versus Republican, or right versus left, or even insider versus outsider, or rich versus not rich. Today, tomorrow, and Wednesday, we'll explore, we hope in a smart way, some current divisions within the conservative movement, within the Democratic Party, and within DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and that's where we'll start. Even as DSA politicians like Zohran Mamdani, Milat Kiros, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others rise in prominence and influence, the DSA is engaged in determining exactly what it wants to be as it tries to actually win elections and then to actually govern rather than just be a kind of left-wing think tank or activist group. For example, Axios had an article a couple of weeks ago called "The DSA has had unprecedented success. It also has serious internal divisions." The New York Times this month had a story about the DSA National Summit in Chicago, where members, quote, debated whether socialist candidates should be free to distance themselves from goals like abolishing prisons as they chase more seats this fall, unquote, from the Times. And maybe you've heard this 45-second clip of DSA National Co-Chair Megan Romer being widely shared on social media now after her appearance on Fox.
So we're going to put up on the screen a few of the things that are part of your platform, and I want to ask you, just give me sort of a true or false on these. Abolish the Senate.
True.
Okay. Replace the presidency and Supreme Court as we now know them.
Yep.
Abolish ICE.
Absolutely.
Abolish borders and give amnesty to anyone currently in the U.S. illegally.
As a long-term plan, yep.
Defund the Pentagon.
Absolutely.
Abolish prisons, at least in large part.
Yeah, again, that as part of a long-term program, yeah.
Okay, so no prisons. Government or public ownership of most large corporations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Megan Romer, DSA National Co-Chair with Fox's Shannon Bream. Certainly you haven't heard words like most of those from Mamdani or Ocasio-Cortez, for example. In fact, and many people don't know this, the national DSA withdrew its endorsement of AOC 2 years ago. We'll explain why. So let's explore the dialogue taking place within the DSA right now with Eric Blank, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at Rutgers, author of several books, including We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big, published last year, and his 2019 book, Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics. He writes the Substack newsletter, Labor Politics, and is a member of the DSA's Bread and Roses Caucus. Which caucus of the DSA he is in will be relevant during our conversation. Eric, always good to have you on with us. Welcome back to WNYC.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. And as a disclaimer, I should say that this is me not speaking in name of Bread and Roses, but in an individual capacity.
Fair enough. And DSA listeners, you're invited to be an integral part of this segment. How close is your agenda to what Megan Romer laid out in the clip? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text if you consider yourself a democratic socialist. What, if any, litmus tests do you think should apply to a candidate for office if they want to call themselves DSA members? Are you enthusiastic about AOC for president, or maybe less so, like reportedly, according to the New York Times at least, many of the people at that recent DSA summit in Chicago? 212-433 WNYC, or anything else relevant you want to say or ask or have a dialogue about with Eric Blank, 212-433 9692, call or text. And again, this is for those of you who consider yourselves Democratic Socialists. You don't have to be formal DSA members, but you have to at least think of yourself as a Democratic Socialist. Tomorrow, we'll do something similar for those of you from any wing of the Democratic Party. And on Wednesday, for those of you who consider yourselves conservatives, some of the conversations within that movement. But for today, Democratic Socialist with Eric Blank from Rutgers and the National, from Rutgers and the Nation, and sometimes writing for Jacobin, and from the Bread and Roses caucus of DSA. Eric, we'll try to get to the viral Megan Romer clip in just a minute and its implications. But, and I know you gave us that disclaimer, can we establish first where you are within the party? I see you are a member of the Bread and Roses caucus. You acknowledge that. Would you describe what that is and its role in DSA as you see it?
Sure. I think the most useful way to frame the divisions in DSA is there's, broadly speaking, a right wing and a left wing, and this is within the context of DSA, so these are very relative terms, right? And overall, I would consider myself mostly sympathetic to the right wing. Bread and Roses is a sort of a center current, but I'm on the right wing of Bread and Roses, so this gives you a sense of how complicated it is. So broadly speaking, on the right, people, they would self-identify more as mass politics, trying to sort of reach out, as broadly speaking, in a way that makes is more legible maybe to the broader numbers of people. And I think on the left, the way they would see it is that they would see themselves as maybe more consistently revolutionary, more consistently socialist, as they would look at, less prone to co-optation. That's how I think they self-identify. And those, broadly speaking, I think the big divide is between the left and right, and some of the internal nuances are a little bit secondary to that.
For all your appearances on this show, one thing I never thought I'd hear was you referring to yourself as right wing.
That's very relative.
But
yes,
I understand the concept, the context. So what did you think of that Megan Romer clip? How much does that represent you, or should people take it as representing where DSA candidates in the midterms as a group want to take the country generally if you scratch below the surface?
I think, put it this way, I think that DSA has this amazing opportunity at this moment to give a voice and organize, literally hundreds of thousands of people, potentially millions. That's the kind of scale that socialist parties in the rest of the world or in the U.S. in the past have aspired to and oftentimes achieved. And my criticism of that Megan Romer clip and some of the sort of similar things that have been said from maybe more the left wing of DSA is that I think that it's falling into a trap which is being set by establishment on both conservative and liberals, which is to try to paint DSA as quite extreme. And so we can go into some of the specifics of like which of those points I agree with or not. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about the particulars. But I think that the basic point is that when we go on national news, whether it's, Fox or the New Yorker or whatever, that's an opportunity to say, like, actually, Democratic Socialists are the only political current, in our view, that has a solution to the crisis that ordinary working people are facing. The affordability crisis, the crisis of political democracy, all of these things that are felt immediately. And when we get into the train of like distant debates of what, this or that could happen down the road, that's the terrain that I think the Democratic establishment wants us to be fighting on. That's the terrain that the Republican establishment wants to be fighting on. And what I think we need to do in things like if we're going on Fox or that is to pivot very consistently to saying, actually, look at what Zoran has done. That is because we believe in working class power. We're fighting for the interests of working class people. It's very pragmatic. We're winning free expanded childcare, we're winning rent freeze. And I think if you can't pivot to the ways that we're going to make a difference in people's lives, then you're only going to appeal, I think, to like the radical activists. And right now we have an opportunity to speak much more widely. And we're seeing that in the votes we're getting for our candidates. But I don't think that we're seeing that articulated as consistently as could be from some of our national leaders.
It sounds like you're saying Megan Romer blew it on Fox.
I certainly would not have argued in the way that she did. I'm trying to be as nice as possible, but yeah, I don't think that is an approach that's going to be able to build the type of power we need to win the types of changes that like American people and working class people deserve.
So here's an example I think, of the position that statements like that put some of the actual candidates for office in. This is an exchange I had with Democratic Congressman Tom Suozzi, who represents a swing district in Queens and Long Island. You probably know he's been making a point of calling himself a Democratic capitalist, and he made his point in an exchange with me partly like this.
It's important to look at what the Democratic Socialists include in their platform. And what they tell you what they believe in, we should believe them.
But that's the premise of my question. There is a national DSA that has these policies on paper, these policy, what you call the platform specifics on paper. Then there's Ron Mamdani, Bernie Sanders, others in real life politics who I think it's fair to say are not advocating the most extreme things that you were just citing.
I don't think it's fair to say that because they should need to be asked those questions. How do they feel about, for example, the Chinese Communist Party? I'm the founder and the co-chair of the Uyghur Caucus. The Uyghurs are Muslim minorities that are held in forced labor camps in China. Why don't we ask Mayor Mamdani, does he support what the Chinese are doing with the Muslim minority in China? Does he support the idea of abolishing the Senate or abolishing the presidency or defunding the police or getting rid of the Department of Defense or these other really extreme things?
He's in office governing now for 6 months, and I don't think I've heard him talk about any of those things.
Well, why don't you ask him specifically the next time you have him on your show? Does he want to get rid of prisons altogether? I mean, that's part of the platform. I mean, I've been in politics for a long time. I've been on your show many times. I'm held accountable for the things that I stand for. I'm held accountable for the platform of the party that I represent.
Well, does it say something to you that he just declined to defund the police? In fact, he ran on keeping the numbers steady in NYPD headcount. So that went on for a while more with Congressman Suozzi and me last month. And, so I was drawing the distinction between what Mamdani ever talks about or has been doing as mayor in the DSA platform positions that Suozzi was spotlighting, more like some of the things in the Megan Romer clip and some other things that he raised there. But you see his argument, Eric, right? That every DSA candidate has to have a position on those positions because they're on paper in the platform, and now that was before Megan Romer went on Fox, so now we have that too. So are purity tests taking place within the party or just abstract debates about how socialist is socialist enough in 2026 America?
So the first thing I would say is that in the chapters of DSA that are electing, people across the country or electing mayors in New York City DSA, there's actually not so much division. And so some of this is really, I think, quite bad faith because there's not a lot of light in between the politics of Zohran Mamdani and New York City DSA, for instance, into leadership. So these types of divisions that we're talking about in many ways are between the chapters that I would consider to have proven themselves to be able to do mass politics by electing large numbers of people, but also by growing. Those tend to be the chapters that you have electing, these prominent politicians. And the debates tend to be on a national level with chapters that just frankly haven't been achieving those forms of success. Mm-hmm. And in part because of that, tend to have more extreme positions. So I don't think that there's so much division actually between the politicians and the chapters that they're accountable to. DSA is not a very centralized organization. I mean, that's a understatement. It's a very decentralized organization. The national DSA is actually quite weak. And so the real power is in the chapters. And so if you look on a chapter by chapter basis, this discrepancy is a lot less. I would say, though, that I think the concern that you flag is a very real one. And I think that, frankly, is just a mistake and bad that national DSA took certain positions that I think are both marginalizing for us and just wrong. So just to give a concrete example, I don't think it's plausible to say that we're even for the long term abolishing the police or prisons. I don't think that even as a socialist in the distant socialist future, I think you can imagine there'll be some sort of some sort of apparatus for that. And so particularly at this moment, though, when you know that taking a position on that is going to provide so much fuel to all of those trying to discredit our elected officials and our candidates, why do that? In what world would it make sense if your goal is to organize millions of people and to speak to millions and to overcome the Democratic Party establishment? Why take a position that you know is just going to give fuel to your opponents, for which there's no practical upshot right now? There's not a mass movement right now to defund the police or to abolish prisons. So it's just like the idea of taking an ideological position for the sake of it seems to me a reflection of a lack of experience and a lack of engagement in mass politics. So I think basically you're right. I think your concern is a correct one. The nuance, though, is that those aren't positions being taken by the actual chapters, for the most part, that are electing these candidates, right? It's a national DSA, oftentimes kind of self-selecting activists against the will, oftentimes of the chapters that are actually electing these candidates. So again, I do think that the way to look at DSA and these debates is that there's a high degree of unevenness between those who are, electing prominent politicians and doing this type of mass growth, and those who are newer to politics. And I would say it's a positive in this sense. Like, I want to say a defense of DSA, including with, people on the left of DSA who I have serious disagreements. There's very few spaces in national or local politics today where people can debate. And, so it's good to your show that this is one of the places where people can debate. But where else can you join an organization where you can have real substantive differences on that? And so I think that's to DSA's credit, that if you're a new person, oftentimes people were liberals a week ago, and then they get radicalized because they're like, oh my goodness, Obama didn't do what he was going to do, Hillary Clinton lost. And then they flip their position, they kind of go too far in the other extreme. I had those positions when I was 18 or 19. It's understandable that sometimes people exaggerate in the opposite direction. And so there is a learning curve. And I think that it's disingenuous, frankly, for the opponents of DSA to try to pick and choose this or that position, when in fact it's not actually the reality of what our candidates and what our most important chapters are doing.
Sally in Manhattan, you're on WNYC with Eric Blank.
Hi there. I can't hear you anymore. I just turned off my radio. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can hear me down the phone, right?
Oh, great. Yeah, perfect. Yep. Yes. I think it's naive to say that what's happening now with Megan Romer is there are definitely two sides to the Democratic Socialist group. And I have always been a Bernie Sanders supporter, AOC. They go for FDR. They go for Scandinavian socialism, which includes capitalism and socialism together. Whole different group. Megan Romer is an avowed Marxist, which is why Trump is now saying that communists are in the left side. She wants production to be in the hands of the people. She wants to get rid of capitalism. And I think we can't say that I think she's actually trying to split the Social Democrats, and that's her purpose, is to minimize the movement. And I think we have to not be naive about this and call her out and call out her and the group that is doing this, as opposed to the Bernie Sanders AOC kind of Social Democrat. And so I think this is a very serious thing, and thank God you're bringing up this issue, because they're not all the same people, and it's not all one movement right now. She is seriously trying to split the movement.
Sally, thank you very much. Eric, do you agree with her analysis that Megan Romer is intentionally trying to split the movement?
No, I don't think it's intentional. I think that in practice, it does undermine the movement, and it does in practice lead to all sorts of divisions. I mean, the left of DSA, one of the things that I've seen that I've found to be particularly counterproductive is it spends a huge amount of time, or has a disproportionate amount of time, sort of attacking the stances or positions of our candidates or elected officials, or pushing back on it. And so I do think that there's some level of factionalism that is driven by that. But, their goal isn't to divide things per se. The way they look at it is, look, people are disenchanted with politics as usual. What we have as socialist people, the reason they think, people are coming to say, which I think there's a kernel of truth to this, is that we stand for something different than what's been on offer for decades, and that we don't make the same compromises that, the Democratic establishment constantly does. And so if we start going down that slippery slope, then we're just going to be like any other Democrat. Now, I think that the conclusions they draw from that analysis are wrong. I think they go too far. But there's a kernel of truth to that. And so I don't think that you have to assume that people are acting in bad faith or trying to split, to say that in practice, the politics and the way they're going about it is undermining and making it harder for democratic socialism, and which to my mind means fighting centrally for social democracy in the mid-range. We're never going to get to an economic democracy or socialism.
Well, you say
if we can't
social
win something like
democracy.
Scandinavia.
The caller also cited that term, social democrats. And in fact, I want to play a clip of DSA candidate Daria-Liza Avila-Chevalier from an appearance on this show. This is after she won her primary. And I asked her what country, if any, she sees as a model of democratic socialism that the U.S. could emulate if DSA gains enough influence. Here's 30 seconds of her answer.
There's a lot we can learn from many parts of the world. I think places in Europe, like Sweden and Norway, for example. But I think looking specifically at the programs themselves, like what are the models of the programs and how can we implement them here, are how I envision this, right? And I think the other thing that gets lost is that is a democratic part of this phrase, democratic socialism, right? Is that we are making decisions in a democratic way about how we use the wealth that we have produced in this society, because the people who are producing the wealth are the people who produce the labor, the workers.
Daria-Liza Avila-Chevalier here. Are you surprised she cited the Scandinavian model? We know that in her old tweets that she mostly has disavowed now. She says she's grown. She sounded more like Megan Romer on some points. But my understanding is DSA says there's a difference between social democracy. You and the caller and Ms. Chevalier all use that term, social democracy, and democratic socialism. That democratic socialism goes further than European-style social democracy. Can you explain how true that is and how much you think it should matter in the current context?
Yeah, I think it doesn't matter so much in the current context, like what words you use. But for what it's worth, the parties that won the most robust welfare states, so if we want to call that social democracy, Sweden, Norway, et cetera, a lot of Western Europe, they were for the most part socialists. They were what we call democratic socialists today, which is that their horizon was not limited to just making capitalism less bad. They did do that. They did that very effectively. But in part, they were able to do that so effectively because they had a vision to say, we believe in democracy in all spheres of life. So I do think that that is a difference between democratic socialism and somebody who just believes that the most human beings can aspire to for the next, as long as human civilizations exist, is some sort of capitalism. I don't think that there's any reason, if you believe in democracy, to say that we should preclude the possibility of democracy expanding to the economic sphere. And even just unions are steps in that direction. So I think that the way to look at it is, in the immediate and in the mid-range, we are fighting for something like Sweden in the 1970s, a very robust universal welfare state. That would be so much better than what we have. It would alleviate so much suffering. And I think part of the problem I have with the way that Megan Romer articulated it, particularly on in the New Yorker interview, was to sort of counterpose, like, we're not for gentler capitalism, we're for economic democracy. Whereas actually, you don't have to counterpose those things. You're never going to be able to get to economic democracy if you can't win a welfare state, if you can't rebuild a mass workers movement. And in fact, and I think this is the crucial point, is the reason so many people think that transformative change is impossible today, including just social democracy. It's like we have to fight hard. It sounds radical to say you're for Medicare for all, even though this is something that most of the rest of the industrialized world has. The reason that sounds so sort of pie in the sky to many people is just they don't have lived experience of that working. The government has been underfunded. They haven't witnessed collective action working. So unless we can start getting people confidence that the government can work better, that's what Zoran, what he's doing is so important. And unless we can give them confidence in their strength and in the strength of solidarity and working class struggle, if you can't do that, you're never going to be able to get to the long-term future. So I think that anything that we do that counterposes that long-term goal to the immediate fights is very, very detrimental to the cause, both in the short term and long term.
We'll continue in just a minute. till the end of the hour with Eric Blank, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at Rutgers, a contributor to The Nation and Jacobin, author of several books, including We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big, published last year. And we'll get to AOC in the context of what we've been talking about, because these days she has the backing of the New York City DSA, but lost the endorsement of the national DSA. Brian Lehrer Show continues. Brian Lehrer on WNYC today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. In this portion of the show, we're exploring, we hope in a smart way, some current divisions within the conservative movement. That'll be Wednesday. Within the Democratic Party, that'll be tomorrow. And within the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, that's what we're talking about now, with Eric Blank from Rutgers and The Nation, and author of several books. I want to ask you about AOC in this context. I see she has the backing of the New York City DSA, but no longer the national. Reading from New York Times reporting on this, it says, concerning, in the eyes of some activists, are candidates perceived to have drifted away from the movement on important policies. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for example, who has made inroads with mainstream Democrats and is seen as a potential presidential candidate, remains a contentious topic among left-wing members of DSA, who said they still resented some of her past positions over the war in Gaza. Though the Congresswoman is one of the most outspoken critics of Israel in Congress, some on the left argue that she has not been strong enough in voicing support for Palestinians. In 2024, the national DSA withdrew its conditional endorsement of her. So, Eric, with your journalist hat on, can you describe any further what happened there in 2024?
Sure. You know, it's just worth flagging, again, the context here, which is that AOC was elected with a strong amount of help and is very close to New York City DSA, which has, sort of consistently been on the right wing of DSA, a mass politics wing. And so there's, again, some of these divisions really seem bigger than they are. On the ground in New York City, it's kind of a moot point. People overwhelmingly in DSA love AOC. They're very excited about her running for president, hopefully. And we haven't had this type of conflict with AOC in the places where it matters. The difference is that, again, in places outside of New York, where New York, the leadership is led mostly by caucuses like the Socialist Majority Caucus and Groundwork. It's a Democratic organization, so there's caucuses on the left all across the country, and they, I think, if you can remember this moment, 2024, October 7th had been a year prior. We were seeing, I remember the moment. I'm Jewish and a longstanding sort of supporter of Palestinian freedom. And I would wake up every morning, seeing little kids killed in Gaza, and I find that, it was horrifying. And in that context, I think a lot of people's powerlessness got channeled not towards productive place, which would be trying to push the government and the Democratic Party as a whole to put real pressure and through, for instance, an arms embargo on Israel. Instead, it seemed, well, if we can't do that, why not focus on someone who might actually listen to us, like AOC? And so much of the sort of anger, which I think was mostly justified, got put towards AOC in a way that I think was totally unjustified, insofar as that AOC is, as you mentioned earlier, one of the most consistent sort of advocates for Palestinian rights and freedom. And that led, to unendorsement on a national level of AOC, which I think was a mistake. I do think that has
was it
changed.
Largely because she continued to support funding for what's described as defensive, military funding for Israel, the Iron Dome, missile defense shield in particular, and that distinction did not fly with that wing of the party?
I do think that was one of the trigger points. To go into the actual voting record, there were some exaggerations made about what AOC did or did not vote on, which I think were sort of unfair to her. But yeah, that was certainly part of it, in which AOC, I think, in my opinion, correctly, has moved away from that and moved towards actually what I think is a totally plausible and important position, which is this: at this point, the United States government should not be funding the Israeli state doing what it's doing, and these kind of nuances between defensive and offensive in practice doesn't actually amount to much. And so both because of the urgency of ending what Israel's doing to the Palestinians, and just frankly the legibility to the American people of why is our money going towards killing people instead of towards social services at home, it makes more sense just to have a sort of a clear-cut stance on that.
Still, the Times said in Chicago at the recent DSA National Summit, strong support for Ms. Ocasio-Cortez was mostly confined to a party at a nearby bar hosted by the Groundwork Caucus, where members chanted her nickname AOC and vowed to convert skeptics to support her for president. So it sounds like, at least at the National Summit, unless that's overreported, there was not all that much enthusiasm. Were you there?
I was not there in part because I have a toddler, and so I declined. But actually, I don't think at this point that this is what I was going to get to before. I don't think that there's much division on AOC these days. Even much of the left, I think, would endorse and support AOC running for president. The level of enthusiasm is certainly higher with Groundwork Caucus and Socialist Majority. But frankly, I think my overall impression, and this is where you get into impressions, it's a little tough, is that the overwhelming majority of DSA members nationally, and not just in New York City, are extremely enthusiastic about AOC, both in general and her possibilities of running. And so part of the difficulty you have with these national meetings is sometimes it self-selects to the most active people and not to kind of the people who maybe have kids and who are involved in their unions, involved in their community. So there's a tricky thing about being in a democratic organization, which sometimes the people who have most time can have a disproportionate sort of voice, and that's part of any democratic process in which some people, there's always a balance between breadth of democracy and the intensity of it. But on the whole, the big story, I think, is actually the extent to which AOC and DSA are aligned these days, and the extent to which there's real enthusiasm about her.
One more call. Judith in Saugerties. You're on WNYC. Hi, Judith.
Hi. Wow. I've tried so often to get on and finally succeeded. Anyway, so I have a number of points that I'd like to make. One is that...
Make your best one, because we're very close to the end of the show.
Okay, well, I'll start with this. Why doesn't DSA ever explain its positions? For example, defund the police, which is a really bad statement, but it really was not defunding the police, but taking part of the money that is going to police departments to other services like mental health. That's what I understood it to be, but I haven't heard a single person, and especially Megan Romer, by the way. I agree with you. She is not a good spokesperson. I haven't heard anyone say that or end the Senate. The Senate is like the least democratic, small d, governing body probably in the Western world.
We definitely could do a whole segment on, of all the things on that list, looking at the Senate as a violation of the one person, one vote principle when, people in Wyoming or somewhere that has a few 100,000 people get the same number of representatives as people in California with 40 million. But on defunding the police, Eric, and this will be your last comment, we have 30 seconds, there are differences of opinion within DSA on this too, right? Some people do talk about police abolition. They use that word, whereas others, like Judith is saying, mean defund the police some and just re-weight where public money goes, right? 20 seconds.
Yeah, I think that the slogan defund the police is very confusing, and it's good that DSA candidates and most DSA chapters, I think, aren't using it because it makes it sound like you don't think any money should go towards the police in the short term. But I think it's entirely the case that, we should be funding social services and public services much more than we're funding incarceration and repression. And that, that message we have to make, and we are making it. And I think it's possible to do that without using a slogan that gives our opponents an ability to marginalize us.
Eric Blank from Rutgers and The Nation and sometimes Jacobin and his book, We Are the Union. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Tomorrow, a similar one on conversation within the Democratic Party. Stay tuned for Allison.